Hello, this is the Fiction Nonfiction Podcast from Literary Hub, where we believe that every issue in your Twitter feed or on the evening news has already been tackled somewhere in literature. I'm Whitney Terrell, the author of the novel The Good Lieutenant.
And I'm V.V. Ganeshananthan, also known as Sugi, author of the novel Love Marriage.
So this banter that we do at the top of the show is supposed to be light and funny, and a lot of times we figure out how to do that banter, even when the show topics are very grim and serious. We've done COVID banter, authoritarianism in Poland banner, Trump banter, but I gotta say, today,
You're not feeling the banter.
not feeling the banter.
Well, when it comes to the occupation of the West Bank and Gaza and the recent attacks on Palestinian civilians in those areas by Israeli military, nothing seems very funny. But it is important. So today we're going to talk to two scholars who can give us a sense of how Palestinian and Israeli writers have written about this conflict in the past and how they're writing about it today.
And because the three of you are colleagues, we're going to talk to both guests at once. And the three of you are together right now. Well, as it turns out, you're actually not going to end up recording together since we recorded this before we recorded this intro, but you're in the same house at least, right?
Yes, we are in the same house. It's a show first. For the record, you were invited too.
Oh, well, I'm sorry I couldn't just hop on a plane and fly up there. Save me a beer, though. I am, however, really glad to talk to both of these guests. First, we're excited to have Shir Alon with us. Shir is an assistant professor of Middle Eastern Studies at the University of Minnesota, Twin Cities. Her work on modern Arabic and Hebrew literatures and cultures has appeared in Boundary 2, Comparative Literature, Arab Studies Journal, and other venues. She is currently completing a book titled Static: Labor, Temporality, and Literary Form in Middle Eastern Modernisms, as well as working on projects on fictions and logics of security in the contemporary novel in Arabic and in Hebrew. Shir, welcome to the show.
Happy to be here.
And we're also joined by Joe Farag. Joe is an assistant professor of modern Arab studies at the University of Minnesota. He's the author of Politics and Palestinian Literature in Exile, published in 2017, and his scholarly writings have appeared in the Journal of Arabic Literature, Middle East Literatures, and the International Journal of Islamic Architecture. Joe's research focuses on the intersection between modern Palestinian cultural production and Palestinian history and politics. And he also serves as board president of New Arab American Theater Works, which is a Minneapolis-based collective of Arab and Arab American theater artists. And a dubious credential, he's half of the duo that introduced me to my fiance. Thank you, Joe. Joe, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me. It's my pleasure.
Very nice to have you with us. By the way, just listeners who are, well, actually viewers, Joe and Shir are sitting in Sugi's living room while Sugi is hiding away upstairs, so we don't have an echo problem, but they are all in the same house, although you can't tell from the video. We chose to have this episode because there was a significant amount of fighting, protesting, and finally airstrikes and death in the occupied West Bank, East Jerusalem, and Gaza, starting in early May until a ceasefire was announced between Israel and Hamas on May 21st. Palestinian health. Oh, and also it's Sunday, June 13th. So Netanyahu is out as the head of the Israeli government. So a lot of news is happening. The Palestinian Health Authority said at least 254 people were killed in Gaza during this period and more than 1,900 wounded. In Israel by May 17th, according to the New York Times, 10 people had died in Hamas rocket and missile attacks and 2 had died in civil unrest. We are here to discuss the literature of the occupation and talk about how Palestinian and Israeli writers have handled it in fiction. But just briefly, for our listeners, could you help us set up the causes and parameters of this conflict in past May? Joe, we're going to start with you.
So the kind of primary spark that instigated the latest round of Israeli violence, primarily against Palestinians, was the pending dispossession of a number of Palestinian families of their homes in the Sheikh Jarrah neighborhood of Jerusalem. Families who themselves, Palestinian families who themselves were the descendants of refugees who had been themselves dispossessed of their homes in what became the state of Israel after 1948. Around that same time, slightly preceding that, the Jerusalem authorities had closed off what's called the Damascus Gate, which is a area around the Haram Sharif, the Temple Mount, where Palestinians frequently would gather during Ramadan after breaking fast. And so this was seen as an instigatory move that was meant to provoke hostility, meant to provoke Palestinians into a response by allies of Benjamin Netanyahu, who at the time was fighting for his political survival. This is a pattern that we've seen over the course of Netanyahu's premiership of Israel, is every time he is facing a political crisis, be it a bribery scandal or fraud or whatever it may be, he or his allies take provocative moves in order to instigate Palestinians to respond, and in doing so, then justify their own much more disproportionately violent response in the name of suppressing Palestinian violence and terror, etc. And so this was just another instance in which former Prime Minister, now Netanyahu, was happy to sacrifice Palestinian lives for his own political survival.
So, of course, Palestinian and Israeli literature is dealing with this long history. Joe, you write about the Nakba, the Naksa, and the First Intifada, and Shir, you've written about these also. Joe, can you define those terms for us and talk a little bit about how the Nakba has appeared in Palestinian literature?
Sure. So what I just described, this pending dispossession of a number of Palestinian families from the Sheikh Jarrah neighborhood of Jerusalem, who themselves were previously dispossessed in a previous round of Palestinian expulsions and kind of forced flights, is what a lot of us refer to as an ongoing Nakba. Nakba is simply the Arabic word for catastrophe. And when historians talk about Palestine and the Palestinians, there's this central point in 1948, which Israel considers the birth of the Israeli state, which is concomitantly what Palestinians refer to as the Nakba, which is the catastrophe. But I think it's more rightly seen as a kind of longer ongoing process rather than an isolated historical instance, being the establishment of the state of Israel. And so seen as a kind of broader process than of dispossession, of rounding up Palestinian populations that do remain into ever smaller enclaves, into fragmenting the actual territorial integrity of whatever little remains of historic Palestine, etc. All of these things kind of combine into an ongoing system of dispossession and of settler colonialism that I think is better encapsulated as in terms of thinking of the Nakba as that longer term process.
Okay, thank you very much for that's very precise. I appreciate that. We want to talk a little bit about, and Shir, maybe you can start off by answering this question. I think in American literary culture, right, the general impression of prominent Israeli fiction writers like Amos Oz has been that they are critics of the occupation and the Israeli government and military. First of all, is that true? And secondly, who are the other? I mean, he's a very famous writer, but who are the other Toni Morrisons, James Joyces, and Louise Erdrichs of Israeli and Palestinian literature that we should be paying attention to as readers?
Okay, so to begin with this question of I guess even the American perspective of the Israeli left wing, which is, let's say, far more conservative than anything that is actually considered left in Israel. And I would say that, writers like Amos Oz, who is usually read together with David Grossman and Aleph Bet Yoshua as this kind of trio of the liberal Israeli politics, did represent a mode of critique of the occupation, as you said, since '67. But I think in order to clarify this, we have to do a little bit of history. So Joe was talking about the Nakba, the expulsion of 1948. The second term Sugi asked about was the Naksa, which is literally translated to the withdrawal in Arabic, and refers to the 1967 war, which is when Israel occupied the West Bank and Gaza, the Golan Heights, and basically established this ongoing situation of an illegal occupation, a lack of established state borders, and a process of settlement building, which is not recognized by international law. Now, I think this historiography is important for literature as well. I mean, we see a difference between the literature of the period between 48 and 67 and the literature that comes after that. So when we speak about
I'm
writers—
just going to break in real quick and ask, what is that difference?
I think it's a long answer. And I think some of it we'll get to it a little bit later, but in the literature leading up to 67, you really see Hebrew literature writing itself as a settler colonial literature. It is asking itself, how do I establish myself in this space? It is seeing the ruins of Palestinian villages around it, and it must, articulate a position in relation to them that also explains Jewish sovereignty in relation to the Arab minority and to the Palestinians who are gone, who have been expelled. After 67, especially in the 80s and 90s, and when the Intifada, the Palestinian uprising, begins, this political energy turns to the occupation and to protesting this form of control of huge population that are not citizens, that do not have any sorts of citizenship rights, as a kind of a solution to the anomaly, which is the Israeli state. And questions about the Nakba, about 1948, about the original expulsion are to a large extent overlooked. Now, in the past few years, it is impossible to ignore them again. And I feel like there's a lot of complex political dynamics going into it. So I'll just speak about Amos Oz.
No, that was really great. Now I'm going to lead you back to Amos Oz, but that was very helpful. Thank you for doing that.
Oh, of course. So yeah, if you have more specific questions, because
that's good.
Summarize a lot of history here. But Amos Oz really represents a generation in Israeli writing that is, comes out of this settler ethos of 48 and feels somewhat betrayed after 67. Because suddenly the state that they identify with is engaged with these kind of explicit atrocities and an illegal occupation, because of demographic changes within Israel that have to do with relationships between Mizrahi Jews, so Jews of Middle Eastern origins, and Ashkenazi Jews. And Amos Oz's writing really represents this kind of, at least when I read it, nostalgic yearning to this period of innocence when the state was small, when the Arabs were, obedient, when men were men and women were women. So yes, absolutely, was a very important voice against the occupation of 67 as a means of, reestablishing the righteousness of the Israeli state within its 48 borders.
Which is kind of ahistorical, which is kind of ahistorical, to go back to what you were saying earlier, but, given that previous stage of Israeli writing, which was much more forthright about confronting that the 1948 to 1967 periods and the kind of settler coloniality of that. And this is kind of predates that, but my favorite work of literature on this is actually Theodor Herzl's Alt Neuland, which is published in 1898, I think it is, and is completely unabashed about the colonial nature of the kind of what he calls the New Jewish Society. They New Jewish Society in Palestine. It didn't even refer to as Israel at the time. But he makes very clear that this will be a wonderful boon to the world's imperial powers, and we will develop cures to malaria here that will allow Europe's imperial powers to venture into the great African heart of darkness, because we will kind of break that final fetter for of malaria, preventing greater colonial incursion into Africa. And so this new Jewish society was seen as a kind of integral part of that settler coloniality. And a lot of, from my kind of more cursory knowledge of Israeli writing, there was a period where that was pretty kind of frankly addressed.
Yeah, I do want to say, when we speak about Israel as a settler colonial society, it kind of sounds very radical right now, very like a new framework, but this was very explicitly the way the settlers saw themselves. Their model was a colonial movement of colonial settlement. They called the settlements colonies. There was nothing that was, secretive about it as a model by which the state was imagined. Of course, it's very different. Zionism is very different as a settler colonial movement because it doesn't have a metropolitan, because it's a settler colonial movement of refugees. So of course it has its specificities, but I think, when we use this language right now, we should remember that this is also the language that was used, very much up to the 50s.
Well, I live in Kansas City. This was a settler colonial society on the Santa Fe Trail,
Yeah.
Joe, just to finish off this question, Shir gave us some of the, like very famous Israeli writers. Maybe you could talk to us a little bit about who are the great Palestinian writers that you would think, from this period should be listened to, right or wrong.
Yeah, so I always fear reifying the canon. If you just name the same authors that everyone's already talking about, then you just kind of contribute to that further entrenchment. But there are similarly these kind of periodizations in Palestinian literary history that have their particularly notable figures. And so in the similar kind of 1948 to 1967 period, Palestinian literature, and this is very, very broad strokes. There are, exceptions to this certainly, but kind of broad strokes, Palestinian literature kind of conveyed the Palestinian experience of being one of kind of abject exile, refugeehood, at the mercy of the, quote unquote, host states that house the refugee camps, at the mercy, almost kind of like this kind of an articulation of victimization, kind of primarily, that after 1967, and with the, it's impossible to overstate kind of how gargantuan the defeat of the Arab armies was in 1967, where the combined armies of Egypt, Jordan, Iraq, and Syria were within a matter of days, really within a matter of hours, handily defeated by the Israeli military. So all of the hopes that Palestinians had pegged onto the Arab states and their vaunted armies to liberate them were dashed. And there was this deeply iconoclastic moment that necessitated a Palestinian kind of reinvention of self. And it's no coincidence then that in 1968 we have the rise of Palestinian armed resistance movements, which had been operating kind of sporadically here and there in the years leading up to it, beginning from the early 1960s. But from 1968 onwards, you see a really sustained armed resistance movement and multiple different armed factions emerging. And so literature responds by reconceiving the Palestinian self from one of being an abject victim into one of a kind of heroic resistance fighter. And this plugs in at the same time as, of course, the Tet Offensive in Vietnam. You have Algerian independence struggles happening. You have this kind of global third world anti-imperialist foment that's taking place. And Palestinians during this period see themselves as part and parcel of that global movement. And so once again, this kind of anti-colonial, anti-imperial ethos reasserts itself. And the iconic figure of the Palestinian goes from being the abject refugee to the kufiya-clad resistance fighter with the Kalashnikov. And so that also comes to be reflected in the literature, but also quite wryly, and I think not very seriously. Like Palestinian literature doesn't take the figure of the Palestinian resistance fighter during this period too seriously. There's a lot of skepticism towards the potential of the armed resistance to actually deliver national independence and sovereignty.
Who are some of the writers you're thinking about from that period?
So you have, so in the earlier period, I include him because he was really the first exponent of this ethos of resistance, is Ghassan Kanafani. Probably the most iconic, the most canonical of Palestinian prose authors. Mahmoud Darwish, of course, is the most iconic Palestinian poet. I have to confess, my knowledge of poetry is incredibly paltry, not just compared to my knowledge of prose, just in general. My knowledge of poetry is quite paltry. And so in terms
I'm going to walk
prose,
down the block after the podcast and quiz people on how many Palestinian authors they know. I don't think I'm going to find anybody who's going to dispute your ability to talk about poetry.
So there's Ghassan Kanafani, there's Jabra Ibrahim Jabra. You also have, starting in the late 1960s, early 1970s, the emergence of avowedly and outspokenly feminist Palestinian authors like Sahar Khalife and Liana Badr, who were some of the most kind of barbed critics of Palestinian armed resistance, because with the Algerian case not far in the background, where Algerian women played a key role in resistance and then were relegated to the domestic sphere and were horribly marginalized just generally. There was a concerted effort by Palestinian feminists in general and feminist authors in particular to not reify or further lionize the kind of very masculinist vision of national independence movements, central to which, of course, was the armed, all predominantly male Palestinian resistance fighter. There are examples, certainly. I don't want to kind of neglect the fact that there were female Palestinian resistance fighters, Layla Khalid being the most iconic example. So women did certainly take a more prominent role in armed resistance beginning in the 1960s as well, but the response of a lot of feminist authors was to be kind of skeptical about this very patriarchal, macho, nationalist movement.
I feel like it's sort of predictable that I'm fascinated by this as someone who writes about Sri Lankan Tamils, but it is fascinating. And also, when I was reading your work, listening to you talk, Shir, you mentioned Amos Oz as someone being nostalgic for the 1948 to 1967 period of greater innocence, the smaller state. And then Joe, when I was reading your work, you were talking about kind of a generational Arab critique of like sort of people post 1967 critiquing their elders as people who had been in, Shir, I think you used the word obedient, and, right, this, so the kind of conversation going on between these literatures is so interesting. And then when we were talking before this conversation, of course, the Nakba is this massive trauma, and it's known as such. And I think people think of it as a Palestinian trauma, and of course it is. And then Shir, you said to me that it was also a trauma for Israelis. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that and about discovering the Nakba again and again in Israeli literature.
Yeah. So when I say, the trauma is a Jewish Israel, sorry, the Nakba is a Jewish Israeli trauma as well, I'm speaking about, the trauma as a trauma as a structure. We usually associate trauma with victims, with victimhood, but the fact is trauma is a threatening experience that the self does not want to process, right? And it remains unprocessed, it remains unnarrated, it remains repressed. And then, as Freud writes, what happens is this material, this repressed content inevitably comes up, inevitably returns. The principle of return is this obsessive repetition and obsessive chewing over these materials that you'd rather not deal with, you'd rather shove down. And we see something very similar, I think, in Hebrew literature and culture, particularly in this early period of the 50s, 60s, up to the 70s. As Joe was saying, in 1948, the expulsion of the Palestinian was a known fact, and we see it very clearly and explicitly in literature. So the poet Natan Alterman wrote poems about this, journalistic poems, where he's very clearly chronicling the massacre of Palestinians in Lyd, where there was a lot of riots and violence just a few weeks ago. He's documenting the expulsions of its citizens. There is a very famous novella called Khirbat Khiz'eh by Sameh Izhar, who was a fighter in the 48 war. He later became a politician, and it's a magnificent text that narrates the expulsion of a Palestinian village from the point of view of a soldier. And there is nothing that is secret there. It's all very clear. He looks at the village and he says, we are creating a Holocaust. We are creating, he looks at them, he sees the Jewish refugees from Europe from just a few years earlier. And from, discussions, this novella was a bestseller. Nobody thought this was something that was hidden. But in years afterwards, the story of the expulsion was denied very, I would say both, passively, people didn't talk about it, but also very actively. So, there were hundreds and hundreds of Palestinian villages that were, that their citizens were expelled or they ran away and were not allowed to come back. In the 50s, Israel starts a campaign to destroy these villages, to not leave them there as monuments to the destruction. Very famously, in a lot of places, forests were built over these ruins. And so and maps are changed, names are changed. There is a very big campaign to change all the names of, be it towns or geographical markers or historical markers to their Hebrew names that completely erase the Palestinian layer of this geography. And what happens is that in 1967, you have a story like Against the Forests by Aleph Bet Yoshua, a very famous novella as well, in which you have a grad student who needs to finish his dissertation. This might be familiar to a lot of us. So he takes himself to some writing retreat in the woods. He takes a job as a woods keeper. And it turns out that there is, under the woods, there is the ruins of a Palestinian village. And he's not aware of that. It's not something that is known. And the village, maybe Joe will talk about that later, but the woods have to be burned down in order for this village to be revealed. So from something that was common knowledge, the Nakba, the Palestinian catastrophe, the expulsion, is staged in this literature as a story that is hidden and has to come to light. In another book that I'm writing on now, which is not as well known, but is just, I wish it was, it's called Funeral at Noon, by a writer called Yeshayahu Koren. And it was written in 66, published in 74. And this is a settler colonial text par excellence, because it's so obsessed with marking the land and marking the geography. And it takes place in a small Israeli colony by the border. And right next to it, there are ruins of a Palestinian village. And it's called in the text, in the very first line, the destroyed Arab village or the abandoned Arab village. And a lot of the plot takes place in that site. All the dramatic stuff happens there. Now, I heard an interview with the writer of the text, with Yeshayahu Koren once. And he said, nowadays everybody's making a big deal that this is happening in a Palestinian village, but I didn't even think about that. The village was just, part of nature. It's the history is unseen. And you read this or you listen to him and you're saying, what do you mean it doesn't mean anything? Of course, this is about the Palestinian village. The novel is about this dissatisfied housewife that keeps returning again and again to this destroyed village, and she doesn't really know why. But that's where she goes in this kind of obsessive return to this moment of constitutive violence of the state. But when Yeshayahu Koren wrote it, when the book first came out, the Palestinian village was not associated at all with this history, even though it's right there in the middle of the text. So it has this capacity to disappear. And we see this cycle happening again and again. Literature every few years stages the discovery of the Nakba because it's not processed. It's like the repressed comes up and then it's just acting out. There is no working through. There is no actual work of decolonization of, okay, what does it mean that our lives are built on ruins? What does it mean that our homes were somebody else's homes? It is just, shoved under the carpet again to reemerge, 10, 15 years later.
And parcel of that is the figure of the mute Palestinian that, again, in Facing the Forest, there is an elderly Palestinian man who lives in that forest. But I think his tongue has literally been cut out in that story. And so he is unable to articulate his own, connection to that land. In Es Izhar's The Prisoner, you have another mute Palestinian. In Amos Oz's My Michael, you have the mute Palestinian twins who Hannah, I think that's the protagonist's name, has these kind of violent sexual fantasies about. And so you have, in tandem with that, seemingly some awareness of the silencing of Palestinians within the narrative that is silencing Palestinians.
Yeah, absolutely. And that is why I'm saying it's, this is a staging. It's a literary trope. It's a mean to keep talking about how we just discover this amazing truth is a way not to speak about what it actually means. It's a way to keep talking about ourselves and our process of nobody told us, we didn't know. It's a means to keep engaging with this self-digging. But I do think things are changing now. In the past 15 years, we do see smaller experimentation and writers that are thinking about modes of collaboration, modes of translation that really take responsibility for this kind of history. So one example is there is they call themselves the Translators Circle in Jerusalem. It's a group that works on translations from Arabic into Hebrew. It's led by Yehuda Shalabani. Can talk about him later too. And it's the purpose there is to think of translation very consciously as a practice that is grounded in unequal power and as a decolonial practice. So for example, on any book that they translate, they will have at least two people working on it, one who is one Jew and one Palestinian, or one person whose native tongue is Hebrew and another one whose native tongue is Arabic. So they work a lot on collaborative translations. They work a lot on trying to dismantle the ways that translation can be a process of appropriation or silencing. So this is one example of what I would call, taking up this history and actually using it as a basis for working through creating something new, not staying at this moment of stunned revelation of
So
the
would
origin.
you put the movie Waltz with Bashir in that moment of stunned revelation category?
There is a genre called shooting and crying.
Okay.
That's the next step in the.
That was a 2008 movie that I don't
Yeah.
know if our listeners will know, but it's worth checking out. And it was a big deal in America. It got a lot of run, I think partly because we were engaged in a very bad war at the time. And there were parallels between what our troops were doing in Iraq and Afghanistan, speaking as someone who's a reporter there, with what was happening there, I think. But anyway, go ahead. I want to hear what you both have to say about that film.
Well, just that, you know, the fascinating Waltz with Bashir is a case study in this genre of shooting and crying, because it really kind of bears the tortured soul of this otherwise idealistic, pure Israeli soldier, and the kind of the horrible things that the situation, you know, compels him to do, and how, you know, how much he struggles with that and so it's his own subjectivity that is constantly being centered in that narrative, to the exclusion. And I'm not in the least bit surprised to hear that is that film made a splash here, because it does seem to kind of resonate with, and again, this kind of idealistic American notion of the self of as being a benevolent, fundamentally kind of force, against all evidence to the contrary.
Yeah, I mean, similarly, as someone who's written about war, like in American Sniper, another film that I consider a bad propaganda war film, there's a moment when the sniper guy, I forgot his name, I don't even want to know his name, is like trying to decide whether to shoot a child. But the scene is played so like worrying about what kind of moral injury it's going to do to him, not whether it's going to hurt this kid or not, right? There's no awareness of the person. That kid is just there as like, well, will he do a bad thing or won't he do a bad thing? And how bad is he going to feel about it later? And that's a real problem for narratives like that, I think.
It's a plot device. The humanity of the other, or the inhumanity of the other, is a plot device to test our protagonist and see, you know, does his moral fiber hold under these strenuous conditions, or does it finally crack, and how does he deal with it in its aftermath?
I love narratives of one man, all he can do. So these disruptions of, Shir, you're talking a little bit about disruptions of process in terms of translation. That's fascinating to me. And you both work on untranslated literatures as well. And I'm also just really interested in how we're talking about time, which is, for me as a fiction writer, is like always the main problem. And you wrote a piece for the LA Review of Books that makes an interesting argument about minor detail, a recently translated book by the Palestinian writer Adania Shibli, which sort of shifts time in such a way that so that you both, Joe, in fact, I think you maybe were talking about the Nakba as an ongoing event. You've both talked about this as it not being that single moment, but as a process. And you wrote about how this book, rather than having the past seep into the present, has the present seep into the past. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that book, about its relationship to this political moment, and also about its handling of time. I was just fascinated by this piece.
Yeah, okay, thank you. Yeah, I'd be really happy to talk about it. I'm happy to talk about Adania Shibli wherever I can. She's a fascinating contemporary Palestinian writer. Her books are so different from the kind of rich, heroic narrative mode that Joe was surveying earlier. And Minor Detail is just beautifully translated. I really recommend it. So I just want to plug it there. And I think this book is so fascinating. The point of origin of this text is an incident that really happened in 1949. So this is after the end of the war that we keep circling around here, the War of the Israeli Independence and the dispossession. And it was an incident in which a group of soldiers that were based in the desert in the Nakba, kind of supposed to guard against what was called then infiltrators, which was just Palestinians trying to get back to their homes after they had run away from the military. So they're supposed to keep the area clean from Arabs. It's quite explicit. And what happened then is that they encountered a man and a little girl. They killed the man, and they basically held the girl hostage, a Bedouin girl hostage, for 2 days in the camp. She was sexually abused and eventually killed. And this was, we're talking about a history that is silenced. This story was unknown. There was a trial at the time. People were, sent to jail over it. It was seen as a very unusual event, but it was secret. And only in, I believe, 2008, some journalists kind of stumbled upon documents from the trial and published a piece on it. This is the piece that Adania Shibli and the character in Adania Shibli's book reads in the newspaper. And she decides, the character decides to try and find out more about that girl, because we know nothing about her. The archive has nothing about her. Nobody knows her name. Nobody bothered to figure out back then what family or tribe or people she belonged to. She was very literally buried in the desert. And the novel is divided into 2 parts. The first part takes place in 1949. So it narrates very bleakly the incident itself. And the second part takes place more or less in the present and follows this amateur detective as she tries to find out more about the girl. And what my question was reading this book is, what is the relationship between these 2 parts? What is the relationship between the past and the present? We often speak about, especially when historians dealing with archives, there is this responsibility to the past. We have to bring out silenced voices. We have to give them voice again. We have to make them present. We have to make these stories circulate again. So the idea is that we have in the present, we have some responsibility for the people of the past. They gave us, they're tasked with something. And there is a sense like that in the novel as well. But at the same time, it's a completely futile search. She doesn't find anything. This is not a spoiler. Nothing, this detective search leads to nowhere. So this project of the redemption of the past or redemption of the present, thanks to the excavation of the past, doesn't work. So in that case, what is the relationship between the past and the present? And there are all these little details, minor details, like the title, that tie between the 2 parts of the book, really random things that keep appearing in these 2 sections, like clues. But it's very tragic because our narrator can't read them as clues. She's completely oblivious to them. We can read them because we have access to the other part, but for her, there is no process of deciphering. And what I think Shibli is trying to do there in this book is trying to ask, okay, how do we write a historical novel about a past event that happened, 70 years ago already, when that past is not that different from the present? And this goes back to what Joe was talking about, this idea of the Nakba as an ongoing process. So it didn't stop in 48. It was not a one-time event, a one-time trauma that we're still dealing with its repercussions, but it's actually an ongoing process of dispossession. And I think it appears very clearly with the instigations of the last cycle of violence, which is very explicitly about kicking people out of their homes, taking over more areas. But this idea of the Nakba as an ongoing process, not a one-time thing, is fairly new. I think it starts to circulate in the early 2000s, when, after the end of the Oslo Accords, it has to do with a sense of, history going nowhere, an inability to imagine some future. Everything is like, we're stuck in this ongoing present. And this is the kind of temporality that I think Shibli manages to capture in this novel. A present that is so pervasive, that has no way out, that has no vision of change, that it colonizes the past as well. It takes over the past as well. We can't even imagine a past that is different, that is other from the present in which we're living. Yeah.
Time is such a big problem for Palestinian literature, because you have on the one hand these kind of halcyon, idealized, romanticized, nostalgic reminiscences of the past, and you have this, utopian, idealized, future, hoped for future of national independence and all the rest of it, and the present is kind of squashed between those two all-powerful kind of historical imaginations, backwards and forwards, and so it creates, like, you so often encounter the sense of limbo in Palestinian literature, where in the present is just this kind of, it exists in a kind of non-space. There is, and so space and time become very integrally entangled in one another as well. So time spent in statelessness, in exile, is essentially time outside of time. It's time, which I think also has resonances with certain Jewish literatures, right? Like it's so remarkable, the ways in which Palestinian exile is now essentially kind of restaging, down to next year in Jerusalem, right? Like, these longings for return, with obviously their own, very different particularities, but the problem for narrating temporality in both of them, I think, is very similar, which is that the present time being spent in exile essentially exists as time outside of time. And so how do you narrate time that is stagnant, essentially?
Yeah. I mean, and I think it's not, it's not just a uniquely Palestinian thing. It's not just uniquely a stateless thing. I think it has very much to do with the neoliberal present, with Mark Fisher and Can't Imagine Anything Beyond Capitalism, or it's easier. Yeah,
it's easier to imagine what the destruction of the universe or the planet than it is to imagine the end of capitalism.
Yeah, exactly. Which brings us to dystopias.
Yes.
But I mean, this idea of a inability to imagine any viable future, of being stuck in a present, I think we see it in The Queue, this Egyptian novel. And we see it in Hebrew literature as well, this kind of working within the horizon of neoliberal accumulation, and not being really able to imagine what comes after that, precisely after the collapse of this revolutionary moment of 67 that Joe was speaking about. And we no longer have a vision of a global socialist revolution. And then after 2000, we no longer have a vision of, two states, one next to each other in the Middle East. All we have is this process of, crisis management. Just can hope to, keep this going for as long as possible without creating too much damage until somebody has a better idea.
And there, to go back to the story that you referenced earlier, Shir
Mm-hmm.
I think it's the final scene in that, as the unnamed soldier is putting a pregnant woman onto a truck to haul her away. He says something along the lines of, what is going to become of that child,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like there is even in that novel, which is published in 1949, which means it was written as these events are taking place. There's this remarkable prescience in it that knows that this is going to, that this will return, and it does constantly over and over,
Mm-hmm.
and which again creates that sense of cyclicality and stagnation that is a real dilemma, I think, for narratives.
So Joe, just a little bit earlier, you spoke about the wryly humorous portrayal of the Palestinian resistance fighter. And I was curious to have you talk a little bit more about Palestinian literature's humor and capacity for self-critique, despite the fact that, you write that Palestinians are staking a claim to identity and land in part through cultural production, in part through writing. And you are, I think, is it fair to say you're impressed by this capacity for self-critique? I'm impressed as I was reading, sort of I'm always interested in art that has the capacity for self-critique and what form that takes. And it seems like here, part of it is humor. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. So on the self-critique note, which I think is really important to highlight, because anyone who's read Benedict Anderson or knows anything about the role that the novel plays in kind of fostering a national identity, knows how important it is that literature do this. And it becomes all the more important in the case of a scattered, dispersed population like the Palestinians, who lack, a unified school system or museums or, all the usual accoutrement of creating a cohesive national identity that is shared among a broad spectrum of the population. Imagine the challenges of retaining a Palestinian identity while dispersed over the globe for successive generations. And so the fact that literature does not balk at criticizing that self-same national identity that it is also in the process of creating is, to me, very remarkable. And when I teach Palestinian literature to students, I think they expect it to be a very kind of outwardly angry and damn Israel and to be, but in actual fact, Palestinian literature spends far more time critiquing both the Palestinian body politic and the Arab body politic more broadly. And so that's a really noteworthy element. Unsurprisingly, perhaps, Palestinian literature is on the whole pretty bleak. Humor is very much the exception rather than the rule in Palestinian literature. And so when it does emerge, I think it makes it all the more noteworthy. And so, there is this conspicuous cluster of humor around literature, and it must be said, cinema as well, produced by Palestinian citizens of Israel. So we've been talking about Palestinians dispersed in exile, et cetera. But among those Palestinians who, the 1/10 of the population that did manage to remain within what became Israel, are now in this absurd situation in which they haven't gone anywhere, but Palestine has left around them, essentially. So they have the inverse problem of the exiles in a way. And they are referred to as Israel's Arab citizens. So they have their Palestinianness stripped away from them, even kind of in terms of the nomenclature, to go back to what Shir was saying earlier about the nomenclature. And so unsurprisingly, from authors like Emil Habibi or filmmakers like Ilya Sleiman, you find this streak of dark, absurdist humor that is being used to comment on the darkly, absurdly humorous situation that those Palestinians now find themselves in as citizens of the state and on paper, fully fledged, equal rights, etc., citizens of the state that is responsible for the destruction of Palestine. And so they articulate that through this very wry, but also darkly humorous mode that is conspicuous to, I think, I really struggle to think of Palestinian authors in exile who write in this similarly wry.
So funny, who don't take themselves so seriously.
Yeah. As opposed to, for instance, Israeli literature, which has embraced more of this kind of absurdist humor.
Well, speaking of that, I mean, Shir's written about Orly Castel-Bloom's Dolly City, which is, speaking of dark humor, I guess. Maybe you could talk about that book a little bit. I know you were involved in pushing for it to be published and had written about that book.
Yeah. So Dolly City is really a kind of event in Hebrew literature. I should say it was published originally, was translated and published in Britain in translation, but it was very quickly went out of print and you couldn't get the translation anymore. So back in, was it 2011 maybe? I don't know. We got it reissued at Dalkey Archive Press, because, this is, the novel, as you said, is a very dark, gruesome, macabre satire, not just about Israel, but about motherhood in general. And I think there's always appetite to read about the psychoses of motherhood. So basically, I don't know if Sugi agrees with me, but basically Dolly City, the protagonist, is Dr. Dolly, who is a kind of a quack doctor. She, as her mother says, she likes to cut for the sake of cutting. And one day Dolly finds a baby in a trash bag and decides to adopt it. Now we should also say that Dolly lives in Dolly City. So it might be just a city in her mind, but it's a very wild, both futuristic and anachronistic city that is kind of London and Paris and New York all at once, with huge skyscrapers and trains crashing constantly and carriages. It's a very chaotic, mad place. Dolly adopts this baby and she decides she needs to protect him against whatever can threaten this child in this world. So she takes up her, medical expertise, and basically throughout the book, she inoculates the baby, and for every single disease that exists, she gives it chemotherapy just in case it might have cancer, in a series of really grotesque events. She decides the baby needs a kidney transplant. So she travels to Germany, takes out kidneys from a bunch of babies, transplants it to her baby, only to realize later that now he has 3 kidneys and she has to take one out. This is the kind of humor and events that happen in this novel. So it's not for everybody, I would guess. But the novel is also, it's very clearly works as a national allegory. It wants to be about the state of being at war. It was composed during the Intifada, so the Palestinian uprising.
Well, you have something that you are obsessed with protecting so much that you destroy the thing that you're protecting, is pretty much what the
exactly, which is also the definition of excessive immunity. So if you immunity, the way it works is to give yourself a little bit of poison, basically, to make yourself immune, able to withstand more. So there has to be a little bit of self-sabotage in creating immunity and creating this resilience. But this novel asks, what if we take it to the extreme? What if this instinct of self-preservation really becomes excessive violence towards the outside world, for sure, but also towards the self? So in one of the most famous scenes in this novel, Dolly carves the map of Israel on her baby's back, in this strange scene of dedication to the nation, to the state. And the meanings of this scene are not completely clear. On the one hand, it can really be seen as this satirical parody of the way motherhood in nationally mobilized societies like Israel, motherhood is mobilized as well. You have to raise your sons to be soldiers for the nation so they can go and sacrifice themselves. But there's, you can see Dolly as this figure of like anti-state ethos, opposition. She was often read like that. But there is also, very clearly, she is a figure of the state there. She is completely embracing this kind of dedication of her child to the nation.
I thought it was so interesting to think about her as sort of like in an endless, she seems to me to be in this endless state of defense,
Mhm.
which, as you note, is not necessary. And then I was reading Joe's book and thinking about the ways that that Palestinian literature has been shaped by, presumably, like, I don't know that it's not right to say an endless state of but a state of, yes, maybe it is right, you tell me, but an endless state of exile, right? Joe's book, for our listeners to remind, focuses on the Palestinian short story. And so, like, as Dolly City and these other Israeli works are shaped by this sort of constant state of defense and the repetition of that, and the state of, I don't know, almost like the state of alarm. Like, I was reading Dolly City last night before I went to bed, not relaxing. Anyway, but Joe, I wonder if you can talk a little bit about short stories and also specifically about a little bit about your book and about how statelessness and exile have influenced Palestinian literature, if there's if this is like a correspondence I can reasonably draw.
So part of my wanting to focus on the short story comes from a kind of constitutional root for the underdog. And so if the short story is the underdog relative to it, to the novel that has, so thoroughly kind of overtaken, and which is, I think, doubly interesting in the Arab context or in the Palestinian context, given that the novel is what do you call it, an introduced genre that is not, indigenous or native to Arabic literature. It's adopted from the European novel, and so the novel has become this kind of, in multiple different ways, this colonial genre. It was introduced to the Arab world as a result of a series of colonial exchanges between the Arab world and Europe. It has itself kind of colonized the literary landscape and pushed out a lot of other literary genres and forms that existed. And so the novel, and poetry still retains its kind of position of primacy in the Arab world, but the novel is kind of, when people say literature, they tend to mean the novel. And so the short story, I thought that it was important to focus on the short story, not least because of the fact that for the first kind of 50 years, into the 1980s at least, it was actually the short story, not the novel, that was the main form of literary prose, literary expression for Palestinians. For understandable reasons in retrospect. You have a dispersed, exiled population that's living in refugee camps, etc., don't have access to publishing houses and printing presses and all of the kind of infrastructure that's necessary to produce a novel. But short stories can be quickly printed out in flyers and distributed by hands and kind of read by multiple people and kind of can circulate with much greater ease. And so it's actually the short story that plays this kind of primary role in the wake of 1948, well into the 1980s, where the short story is actually the main vehicle for Palestinians to articulate their experience of dispossession and colonialism and exile and so on. And the short story, because of its characteristic trait, which namely its brevity, is able to respond to these successive exigencies that are happening to the Palestinians with great speed, right? As opposed to the kind of longer meditation that is the novel's domain. The Palestinian short story is able to respond very quickly to political events as they transpire, and is able to be printed out and distributed informally, by hand in handbills, et cetera. And so there is this immediacy to the short story that is just kind of logistically much more difficult, if not impossible, for the novel. And that's why the short story really enjoys this period of primacy until the 1980s, when Palestinians do kind of establish themselves more in their communities of exile and do start to publish lengthier novels, et cetera, at that point.
So interesting. That Shir, I think, referred to the journalistic poems before. Joe, you're sort of talking about, short stories as a kind of pamphleteering or breaking news. And will admit that I am somewhat dismayed to think that, of course, my novelizing is also probably colonial. I will have to go and reflect on this.
All modern genres to some extent. I don't I don't know. I have a hard time with this kind of narrative of the novel being foreign to our indigenous roots. I mean, yes and no. Like we all learn to write as modern people.
Exactly. That's not to say that.
And it's not just colonialism. Like the novel is also the genre of capitalism, of capitalist modernity. Like, sorry, Sugi.
I already told her that
everything
being a
against
novelist
it.
was one of the most capitalist things that you could possibly do. She got really mad, but it's true. All right, so we have one last thing that we're going to talk about here. One of the worst things you can do is talk about Israel and Palestine if you want to have people yell at you on Twitter. I can't think. Yeah, okay, that's true. I can't help it. We were thinking about your representative in Minnesota, Ilhan Omar, got in a lot of backlash from members of the Democratic Party, actually, for referring to, quote, atrocities committed by the US, Hamas, Israel, Afghanistan, and the Taliban. Rashida Tlaib, who defended her as the first Palestinian member of Congress. Can you talk about censorship of conversations about Israel and Palestine and how that space is changing inside and outside of academia and publishing?
Yeah. So first, I want to call out an article that Fadi Judah just published in the Los Angeles Review of Books. Yes, I think it's called something like My Palestinian Poem That the New Yorker Rejected. And it's a long essay exactly about this question, the gatekeeping for Palestinian voices in the American sphere. Why is it much easier for Jews and non-Zionist Jews and Jews critical of Zionism to speak about Palestine than it is for Palestinians, because of the question of censorship and backlash, which we still unfortunately see in academic spaces, as well as in journalism, even though there was some, I think, this past cycle of fighting, we did see some changes in the way it was covered in American media. And this has to do with these new Democrat voices. This has to do with Black Lives Matter.
Yeah, Black Lives Matter.
Yeah, George Floyd, people becoming more aware and conscious of instances of structural racism and Jewish supremacy, white supremacy. Terms like apartheid are much more common and accepted now. But I mean, these changes are not happening without a backlash. So one of the things we briefly mentioned it is the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism, a working definition of anti-Semitism put forward by the International
Holocaust Remembrance
Association. Thank you. That is supposedly very broad, but also very problematic because it allows criticism of Israel to be defined as anti-Semitic speech. And there is a widespread effort for campuses, organizations, to adopt this definition and to use it as a means of silencing critiques of Israel. So this is the kind of backlash that we see because I think the narrative is changing.
Where I think even the claim that Israel is a settler colonial state potentially runs the risk of falling afoul of that IHRA definition. And so, that just goes to that even this conversation, because we simply alluded to the fact that early Israeli literature was itself fully cognizant of the settler colonial reality of the Israeli state, this potentially itself has could fall afoul of that definition that would equate criticism of the state of Israel or the assertion that Israel is a racist state from its inception, et cetera. I think that was one of the examples. There's a series of examples given on the IHRA website I can't remember exactly. I think it's something like 11 total examples, of which 9 specifically refer to refer to Israel.
Yeah.
And so most of the examples that they themselves give incorporate Israel as a kind of integral aspect of anti-Semitic speech.
In short, you got yourself into a big load of problems.
Well, half my family is Jewish, so we'll see. They criticize Israel a fair amount. I'll talk to them about that rule and see what they have to say. Shir, Joe, thank you for joining us. We really appreciate it. And listening to you. It's great.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having us. This was a pleasure.
And listeners, don't miss Joe and Shir's work. We'll link to the writers they've pointed us to also in our show notes, so you can see that and also read their work there. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Cheers.